Hello everyone, this is Stephen with Renewed Ministries. This will be part of an ongoing weekly series taking a little deeper look at the Gospel of John, or the fourth Gospel. And today I will be looking at the prologue. My hope had been to pull video from the church that I pastor because I'm going through John there each week as well. But we had some technical issues. The audio was not captured for some reason. So I want to do just a hopefully relatively short look at the beginning of the Gospel of John, and each week we will kind of walk through different aspects of the Gospel, as well as ultimately we will have read through the entire Gospel. It will take, I suspect, maybe a year or so, maybe not that much, but it's going to take a good bit of time. So the Gospels are nothing more than capturing the good news of Jesus Christ, his ministry, his life on earth, a little different than the epistles that Paul wrote, or Peter, or Jude, which were written to specific audiences. Although we do see the Gospels do have a specific audience, at least a couple of them. Matthew was written largely, it is believed, to the Jewish community, and was a telling to that community of that they had rejected one of their own. We'll see that a little bit here in John, and giving them the good news that they could come to Jesus Christ. Luke was addressed to Theophilus, which could be or could not be a person. It could be a general title for a lover of God. That's literally Theophilus. Or it could be a person who had that name. Mark is a little different, and I want to offer that as a comparison as we start looking at the prologue of John. In Mark, it says the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. When you start that gospel, that's what you read. And Mark is very quick-hitting, and it moves through at a very rapid pace. It is the shortest of the gospels. The use of the term "and immediately" is very prevalent throughout that gospel. When you go to John, we have a very different beginning. Luke and Matthew both recount the genealogy of Jesus Christ and bring almost this earthly quality, more Son of Man, although they certainly don't shy away from the divinity of Christ. But their beginning is the fleshly roots. Mark begins with the ministry of Jesus. When you turn into the Gospel of John, what we have is this very Christological, this very high portrait of who and what Jesus is. John also begins with a beginning, much as Mark does, but in John, and today we'll look at verses 1 through 18, which is the prologue, it says, "In the beginning was the Word." We don't have a name, we don't have a title, we just have, and quite literally, "in beginning." So there's no definite article there. And there's some that would say that points to the eternal past, that there is no beginning and there is no end. But for John, we're looking at beginning for now. There is no beginning of Jesus Christ. We don't get into Arianism. We don't get into Jesus as a created being. We certainly see that he was begotten. We'll see that in the prologue. But Jesus just simply always was. There is no definite point for beginning. In Genesis, and these words echo Genesis quite a bit, what we have is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so you have this definite type of beginning that begins with creation. Even though you don't have the definite article in Genesis, and God simply always was. But the beginning of the recounting of mankind begins with creation. And John proposes that a little different, I guess we could say, because for him there is simply no beginning. The Word just always simply was. And you can almost see this Trinitarian way of bringing this out too. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So it is clearly two separate entities, because The word being with God is a sense of being in the presence of God, not being necessarily in God. Those are two very different words, and the ancient Greek language, Koine Greek language, definitely had words for that, to separate in or of or beside or in the presence of. And this is really talking about the Word was in the presence of God, and the Word was also God. They are inseparable, but they are two. And the same was in the beginning with God, or in the presence of God. And all things were made by Him. So here, where Genesis immediately goes into creation, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In John, we have to go down to verse 3 before we see anything about creation. God and the Word, Jesus Christ, is what we will soon find, simply always was. There was never a time when they were not, and there will never be a time when they will not be. And in the creation here, it says, all things were made by Him. Without Him was not anything made that was made. So we understand that God from Genesis is the creator. But John almost frames it in a sense to where Jesus is that creative agent. One could argue pretty strongly, especially from the text of Genesis, and I believe also here, when you get into the depths of logos, the Greek word for word, or the Greek word that is translated as word here may be a better way to put it, that the creative agent is not just Jesus Christ, but also the Holy Spirit. It is an impossibility to speak a word without breath, and breath is very much a way of bringing about the Holy Spirit within the text of the Bible. So all things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. That means the trees, that means the air, that means even us. We were brought about by that creative agent, if you want to term it that way. God is the creator, but He is not creator alone. He is creator with the Word. And in this Word, in Him, was life, and life was the light of men. Light is a very prominent theme, particularly through the first portion of the Gospel of John. Now, you can take the Gospel of John and you can break it into two large sections, the first being chapters 1 through 12, which is the book of signs. It's the life and ministry of Jesus to the general public. Then you can also flip to chapters 13 through 21. The book of glory is typically what it's called. And that addresses the glorification of Jesus, the passion of Jesus, His final moments with His disciples, so forth and so on. But you have in this first part, this book of signs, a very prominent theme of light. And that will actually be what I will cover next week. But it's worth realizing, worth mentioning, how prominent light is even just within the prologue. In the prologue, you have light mentioned in verse 4. Again, in verse 5, you have the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Then you have it again in verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. In verse 8, we have light mentioned again. He was not that light. In other words, John was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light being the Word. Again, we still don't have a name for the Him which the Word is referring to, but we will get to that. Verse 9, also light is mentioned again. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. So we have light mentioned a lot. Light is prominent throughout. You could argue for light being very prominent in the story of Nicodemus, which we will take one entire portion just to look at Nicodemus. We have light in chapter 8 and chapter 9. Chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus says He's the light of the world. And we have that echoed again in chapter 9 and verse 5. And then we also see light come into play at the very end of the book of signs at the end of chapter 12. So all of that is very important. Light is very prominent, and we will trace out light a little bit next week. There's some other points in this little section here of the prologue that I believe is also important. We'll go back to verse 6. It says, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now we understand that this is John the Baptist. What is interesting, and some would say could even point to the fact that speaks to an author. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite commentaries on this is from D.A. Carson. It's the Pillar New Testament commentary on the Gospel according to John. And in that particular commentary, he makes this statement. It is on page 120 in his commentary on these verses. He said, interestingly, it is only in this gospel that there is no additional description such as the Baptist, even though the evangelist, speaking of the author of this text, is careful to distinguish other characters who bear the same name. For example, then Judas, not Judas Iscariot, that was specifically mentioned in 14:22, and then also in chapter 13, verse 26, he says he gave it to Judas Iscariot. He goes on to say the evangelist does not need to identify John as the Baptist because he never mentions by name the only other John in Jesus' circle, John, the son of Zebedee, the brother of James, and intimate of Peter. The traditional explanation for this silence is still the best one. John, the son of Zebedee, was responsible for this gospel and preferred to refer to himself only obliquely. So some would argue that you could take the entirety of this text, of this particular gospel, and use that commonality that he seems to leave out here and point to that he did not want to mention himself anywhere, so there was no need to indicate that this John was anything other than John the Baptist. Now, it could be, just to play devil's advocate, it could be that there was no need to mention that it was John the Baptist, because when you read the text, you understand that this is the forerunner that he's talking about, and that's understood that is John the Baptist. And then we also see it again later in chapter 1. And it gives a clear understanding of who it is. I tend to at least somewhat agree with Carson what he's saying here, that the author is the traditional authorship that we subscribe to, that we adhere to. It's the gospel according to John the Apostle, not John the Elder, which some would propose, or others. One interesting thing, and we will spend at least a part of 1 week addressing the gospel whom Jesus loved, or the disciple whom Jesus loved. And typically that is understood to be John the Apostle. But if you just take the text and you read the text, it would seem to point to that being the person of Lazarus. So there are some theories out there that Lazarus could have been the author as well. But I hold that history has it right. We have the gospel according to John. And verse 6 could very well be something that points to that. A couple of other points in here. If you notice, we still don't have a name for this him that the light, that word is referring to. And that particular word that is translated as word, I know that sounds a little redundant, but logos or logos is a very, very deep word when you go to researching it. One of the research tools I often use is the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. It breaks down and gives an incredible background definition research for all of the prominent words. There's only been 1 or 2 words, in fact, I have not been able to easily find an error. But when you look up logos, you'll see it also combined with lego, which is to say logos is typically translated as word. But what you will find when you research back through that, logos is also a philosophy, a way of thought. It's where we get the word logical from. It's also part of the root of the word catalog, which is to enumerate or to put into order. In fact, in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, when you look up the word logos, what you will see is 30 pages of research and history before you ever get to this particular use in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. So it is a very, very deep and rich history that goes with this word. And I believe, and this is my personal opinion, that that word was chosen on purpose because of that deep and rich history. Jesus is more than just a spoken word, which is what we understand today. But he really is a way of life, a worldview, a philosophy, which is the only real and true philosophy. He is also that creative agent as the Word that brought about creation in conjunction with God the Father and the Holy Spirit. And in much the same way, you have the word light here also describing Jesus, which he later says as a title for himself, that he is the light of the world. And no more can you shut down ideas and thoughts and reverberating airwaves from spoken word than you can shut down true light. Light just shines and it permeates everything. And I believe that these combination of words is very significant, particularly when you hold it into the balance with the rest of this particular gospel, because we find this reality that Jesus should permeate all that we are. We should be consumed by Jesus, and that should be our passion. That should be our life. That should be our source. That should be our thoughts, our ideas, our words. So I believe it's more than just random word choices. I believe it was a very well thought out picture that John is trying to paint here for this man that we will come to find in verse 17 is called Jesus Christ. But let me read a little bit more of this prologue, and then I'll try to wrap up a little today. Verse 10 is where we left off. Verse 9, that was the true light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. And one of the things I brought out at church the other night is this. That seems to be a rather harsh statement, that he came into the world which he created, and the world didn't know him, and even those that he was born, as far as that earthly genealogy goes, his own, what we would consider family, ethnic background, nationality, culture connections, they did not even recognize who he was when he came. So we get this dark sense of rejection and being alone, and no one believed, much like we get sometimes in our own ways. We'll all have or will at some point get into areas where we feel like we are very much alone in how we believe or why we believe certain things. Nevertheless, we have this dark picture painted here that no one received Jesus. But understand that everywhere throughout the course of the Bible, everywhere that we read in the text, where we see this vast rejection, this large amount of people that are not accepting what's being told, the message from God, or even Jesus, there is always a remnant.